Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by the one and only Layman Pascal, who I always introduce by saying he needs no introduction. Though, for those who would still like some words of context for who this wonderful human being is, of course, Layman is the host of the Integral Stage podcast, a frequent, let's say, opiner, thinker, pundit, speaker, thoughter, thinker on matters of metamodern spirituality, integral spirituality, meta theory, many, many things. Of course, you have a Substack, and now you are a writer in published form in a particular way in terms of a full volume release of your book, Gurdjieff for a Time Between Worlds, hyperpersonal essays on the grandfather of metamodern spirituality, which I've had the joy of being able to work with you on for releasing this through the Sky Meadow Press, which is the first volume to come out through that initiative. And so today we're going to dive into this book. The other hat that Layman, of course, wears is reflector upon the person and works and ideas of G.I. Gurdjieff, which is the topic of this book. So, yeah, Layman, thanks for coming on the podcast again to talk about this.
Hmm. Nice to see you, my friend. Very lovely introduction. And I'm going to put frequent opiner on my business card now.
um, as you should. So, yeah, I mean, again, one of the things you have a very voluminous mind, and so those opinings could go in any number of lightning directions. But the one I wanted to conduit that energy through today is related to Gurdjieff, and you've written this book, Gurdjieff for a Time Between Worlds. And yeah, I think that this is just a great opportunity to help introduce people to this book, maybe to yourself, and also to the ideas of Gurdjieff as reflected, inflected through the mind of one Layman Pascal. So that'll be sort of some of the stuff we'll try to tackle a little bit today. And as you know, beginnings must be made somewhere or another. Let's make a beginning on this. Let's say, who is Gurdjieff, for those who may not know, and why did you want to write a book on this figure?
Uh, Gurdjieff, lots of different pronunciation options available. He was a Greco-Armenian sage who was born in the late 19th century and went on to become one of the most creatively potent and unique early 20th century voices about the new possibilities of spirituality or new contemporary ways of taking possession of our ancient spiritual practice and insight lineages and modifying them for the kind of planetary civilization that was emerging under and beyond modernity. He's definitely one of the underexplored theorists. You don't hear his name as often as a Rajneesh or a Bindo or any number of these other Trungpa, very populist 20th century teachers. That's partly because he was a difficult man. He was very challenging for people. He's very comprehensive and flexible and effort laden in the way he communicates interpersonally, the way he communicates through his writing, and the particular lineages that descend from him have not been as uh, publicly absorbent and promotional as many of the other kind of neo Hindu lineages. So there's this sense that there's a huge teaching there that's very interestingly phrased, very potent, continues to be pertinent as we move forward as a species. And it's kind of lurking. It's underexplored. There's a lot of people who've heard this name, but they haven't really taken a dive into it. There's a lot of people who have a kind of surface level knowledge of what they think are some basic framings, which may turn out to be not representative of his work at all. So you've got very powerful, very strange, very humorous, very creative, very agile minded, international kind of planetary figure who's produced a really unique stream of Dharma. And it may be a moment in which there's a kind of Gurdjieff renaissance coming. The number of people I know who are rethinking it, mixing it with various things, sort of picking and choosing from the Gurdjieff buffet and mixing it with their own lives, it's really wonderful. And I think there's been a couple of generations of his students and of a kind of tension between the formal students and these weird outliers who take it in their own directions. And I think all of that has the potential to come together now and create a really fertile convergence if people are willing to play with that.
Yeah, one of the questions I wanted to pose to you was that timeliness. Gurdjieff for a time between worlds, and the relevance or the question of the relevance of this figure for today. You refer to him as the grandfather of metamodern spirituality, or a grandfather of metamodern spirituality. And so I was curious about that aspect of this. What ways do you see Gurdjieff as being metamodern, proto-metamodern, or in some ways speaking to this metamodern moment and a metamodern spirituality?
Yeah, there's a question of what you would look for in a person to identify them as putatively metamodern in some sense. And I think one of the things you would look for is a combination of someone who has um, the capacities to do the postmodern cognitive and social processes on the one hand, and an additional capacity to bring novel coherence and integration to that in a way that promises a useful way forward on the other side of modernity and its excesses and its self critiques. And he's definitely done that. If you read through uh, especially the introductions to his work, you get a sense of what his approach to culture and language is. And the things he brings up, you wouldn't be able to bring up if you didn't have at least the postmodern kind
Mm.
of pluralist, post-formal cognitive capacity. But he obviously doesn't stop there. He moves into a system that has multiple types, developmental stages, is specifically phrased in ways that bring the spiritual and the technical together, interestingly, and they're very deliberately oriented towards a planetary, transcultural, and ecological framework. So all of that continues to be very pertinent going forward. So I can make a pretty good argument that he's at least proto-metamodern. And by calling him metamodern, you really just want to say it continues to be pertinent and it is of special pertinence to the kind of people that are trying to do post pluralist, integrative, developmental thinking in any area of life and culture.
Yeah, one of the things that came through to me while reading your book is the similarities that I was detecting between Gurdjieff and Kierkegaard, who's a figure that I'm much more familiar with and have a lot of love for, and also see as having, or let's say, as speaking particularly relevantly to a metamodern moment and a metamodern sensibility, specifically in the way that, say, Kierkegaard would use language, characters, sort of irony to disrupt the very frame in which he was presenting his ideas. There's something about the medium also being the message as well, and trying to and just naturally being sort of self-reflective of the modes of communication used to speak a dharma or a teaching or a set of ideas that has spiritual significance. And so it seems like Gurdjieff is doing something similar. What would you say are some of those connections, or at least some of the strategies that you see him employing in that manner?
Yeah, we definitely, although the kinds of basic neuropsychological skills that we see expressed in metamodernism, you can find them in thinkers going all the way back. But notably, you find them in really top notch, idiosyncratic thinkers who are facing early critiques of the modern already in the 1800s. So you find them in Nietzsche, you find them in Kierkegaard, and people like that. And some of these common features are first of all, the notion of gradations, stages of development at which
Mm.
there are paradigmatic shifts in how you do valuing in world spaces. You often see a facility, as you know from your own work, in pseudonyms, characters, playing the capacity for reference and persona off against itself in ways that problematize it and then reconsolidate it. You definitely see that in both Kierkegaard and Gurdjieff.
one of the things that I think is also both there is that there's a kind of, I think this comes from the irony, but the trickster-esque figure, this sort of like shamanic role of playing with, of using play itself to facilitate some kind of seriousness, some serious growth and spiritual development. And there's an element, it seems like, in Gurdjieff, that he is a figure who is wily, has a kind of trickster persona to him, a bit of a chameleon, a bit he's not kind of just your sage sitting there making pronouncements in some oracular tone. That there's a little bit of wildness there, and speak a little bit to that. And I wanted to kind of dig into that topic a little bit. So yeah, what's your concept of how Gurdjieff plays that role?
Yeah, there's a phrase that's often associated with Gurdjieff, which is the sly man. He uses this phrase in his early teachings that he's discussing the way of the sly man. So there's a certain kind of adaptive, flexible, opportunistic, creative, novelty seeking character there, and that this maybe is a teaching for people who are good at those sorts of skills, although clearly you don't find that homogeneously expressed among Gurdjieffians. Nonetheless, it's a guy who, and Kierkegaard too, can communicate seriously with language and be outside of the language they're using at the same time and allow those to cross pollinate each other. In Gurdjieff's case, a lot of that comes from the fact that he was multilingual. He'd spent a lot of time in different cultures. He had a very adventurous early lifestyle, so he was able to saturate himself in different sociolinguistic contexts and in different practicing streams of Dharma from around the world. Hmm. I think as a human being, he had a tremendous sense of resilience and humor, which lends itself toward play. But I think there is a lot of play in the meta-modern move specifically. John Vervaeke will discuss serious play, but you see serious play in Nietzsche, in Kierkegaard, in Gurdjieff. The seriousness of it is also very essential. Like some people relate to Gurdjieff very much as a hard teacher in a difficult way. And that's partly because he emphasizes words like work and effort, and he has a particular approach to leaning into suffering to generate self-development. So it's not new agey. It's not the kind of postmodern spirituality where you just say everything is positive and try to cling on to that reality. It's definitely willing to play in the darker areas. So there's a seriousness to it. There's a weightiness here, but it's also extremely playful. This is a guy who's very creative, almost surrealistic in how he writes. He's willing to change what he's saying as he goes. He is, I think, unthreatened by a lot of the things that bother people interpersonally. And so even the normal cultural ground of two people meeting each other is an amphitheater of play for him. So in addition to his teachings and his writings, there's a great kind of auxiliary literature about his weird interactions with both students and regular people he happens to run into, which make this kind of really wise but genuinely radical and funny and playful character stand forth.
Yeah, and partly the some of those anecdotes about him and his interpersonal style and his difficulty were things that stood out to me. We often tend to think of spiritual figures as being sort of, serenely sagacious, kind of just sort of always easygoing and always sort of gracious and charitable. And I think there's good reason to associate that with spiritual figures. But Gurdjieff seems to not just be someone like that or at all like that. And I was curious what you'd make of that when in some ways also spiritual teachers are supposed to be exemplars, right? So this has always, I think, been a tension in sort of crazy wisdom traditions and the various sort of more eccentric forms of teaching and transmission. But like, what do we make of a spiritual teacher who who is incredibly difficult sometimes to deal with? Maybe what's the word? Just irascible and strange and upsetting to people, right? How do we see the teaching there when sometimes if we're looking at that as sort of a moral exemplar type, that there seems to be maybe even something of a failure there? How do we reconcile those sorts of things?
Yeah. I think there's a number of different ways to look at that. One is certainly that the teachings are not for everyone, right? There's a certain kind of person for each kind of teaching. Gurdjieff is not on the street corner telling everyone equally that they should be doing this. So it's more useful to certain types of people who are drawn to it. And I think there's a real social wisdom and epistemic humility in not imagining that your form of teaching is generically the best thing for all human beings. Secondly, of course, he's a human being. He's not presenting himself to you as the supremely realized divine avatar. So when you see his compulsions and his play and his mood shifts and his emotions, it's always hard to know, and it probably should be hard to know. You should have to use your own intelligence to try to figure out, is this part of the teaching or is this just a guy who's having a bad day or whatever that
Hmm.
is? So those things are, I think, cautions before trying to think about topics like this. When you get into the nitty gritty of it, several things stand out to me. One is what we might call a tantric approach. And in a tantric approach, the idea is that you should be able to allow, accept, work with, and upgrade all the different emotional flavors that are available to you as an organism. We're trying to create a full spectrum teaching. Now, there are teachings where you say, what we're going to do is put most of your humanness out of bounds here, right? Just no sex and eat less and don't say any upsetting things and don't think any thoughts like this and just keep it on the straight and narrow. And that may, in fact, be a very good way of teaching for certain kinds of people. But if you can handle it, the ability to play at your own edges, the ability to welcome the full range of human emotional complexity and intensity, that starts to generate a different kind of character in you, and it starts to be able to create a different kind of dharma out of you, a dharma that is applicable to all the dimensions of human existence and not just to a specially secured niche of spiritual development. So I think it gives him a tremendously human character. I think it gives him a kind of creative energy and interestingness that you don't find in a lot of other spiritual teachers. I would also say that probably every spiritual teacher is difficult at times. And in many cases, that's concealed from us, right? It's just like I always say, don't join a cult that wants to convince you they're not a cult, right? Someone who wants to hear our teacher is perfectly serene and benevolent at all times and never has any emotional range. He probably does. You're just not getting to see it. So it's refreshing and I think more honest and more humanizing for him to be able to show it to you. And then there's a very esoteric element to this as well, which is if you have command of those forces and you're the right kind of person, you might generate strange responses in yourself to put certain kinds of pressure on people who have explicitly volunteered to be trainees, right? They've said, I wish you to fix this machine. And you go, well, it's going to involve some welding. It means I'm going to have to apply some intense heat. And the way we apply that is through certain kinds of emotional pressures. And the question is usually, is that person, are we A, getting really wise results out of that, or are you just harassing people? And then B, is there a kind of equanimity that exists in that person through and beneath the intense emotional expression? We have a lot of these stories about Gurdjieff, like the very famous story of someone coming across him really just in a rage against one of his best pupils. And the person at the door looks at him and he looks over and winks at this person and then goes back to just this devastating tirade, right? So that kind of like, okay, there's in the East, they talk about these gunas, right? You can be like too hot, too excitable, or too lethargic. You can be rajas or tamas, or you can be sattvic. You can have equanimity. But there's also a kind of like meta sattvic approach where you can bring equanimity to excitability and lethargy in various interesting ways. And through that, like I was saying, I think you learn more about and create a teaching that's better for the richness of the human experience.
Hmm. Thanks. That's great. There are many layers there, and clearly there's a lot to that. And, yeah, I wouldn't want to belabor that topic, though I think it's an important one, and I think one that you handle well and with its nuance, because obviously the ways that those dynamics can become oppressive or pathological or traumatic or whatnot. We've seen those kinds of crazy dualisms go in that direction in various ways. At the same time, I mean, the fact that we have this legacy about this figure speaks to the enduring impact that he made in a positive way on all these people. And so that also needs, importantly to be taken into account. And I don't mean to suggest either by this line of questioning that Gurdjieff is just purely this, irritable, angry, strange, eccentric, unpredictable figure. But I think that there's an element of his teaching style that, at least when I was reading your book, was really gave me a lot of to chew on. Um, Now, you mentioned also the kind of parts work you were earlier talking about, trying to bring all those pluralities into harmony in a sense, and in the context of something we were speaking of. And of course, that's a big part of this book, of your work, of his work, and I think of sort of metamodern and integral and et cetera thinking is in terms of dealing with the plurality of things, trying to sort of assay them and then integrate and coordinate them to produce something more integrated, and then get a kind of surplus cohesion from that. And you get into that a little bit in this book. So maybe talk a little bit about that aspect as it pertains either to Gurdjieff, to metamodern thinking, all of the above.
Yeah, there's a way in which pluralistic psychology plays a role in existential development and sacred culture building going all the way back. And part of this book is um, a suggestion that Gurdjieff stands in a kind of ancient shamanic lineage that also has to make a recovery in this time period. But when we think about animistic spirituality, as long as we're not talking about it in a really fundamentalist sense, we're talking about something where you can have a transactional plurality type experience that's developmental and healing for you based on your experience of spirit not being something that's either located only within the individual or only within some epitomized sky deity, but is distributed to different areas of your potential experience. So I think that goes way back in people. And it's almost an anomaly to have had this temporary period of really book heavy cultures in which there was the single author deity superseding the pantheon. I think we all, at some level, recognize that we have to deal with the world as a pantheon and deal with ourselves as a pantheon. And that's become more explicit lately with models where the multiple self is not problematic. It's not a schizoid disorder, but is essentially the normal condition of the human psyche that we overlay with a sort of a virtual sense of unification. Now, whether or not unification is fundamentally possible for us, or whether there's a secret individual signature within us, nonetheless, just on the ground, looking at beings neuropsychologically, we see that they are essentially a plurality. There's this notion of a symphony of selves now that characterizes a lot of integral and metamodern thinking. This notion of the individual that comes down from Deleuze, that we have to get over um, the kind of modern like the hegemony of the notion of the pre-given individual, so that we have something inside ourselves that is similar to the kind of collective intelligence we're trying to build outside ourselves. That there's an analogy between these two kinds of intersubjectivity. Now, Gurdjieff is very interestingly positioned in that because he's speaking at kind of the high point of modernity, but he's already critiquing it, right? In the very early teachings that he starts to give in Russia in the early 20th century, he's saying you're not a singular being, and you can just find this out. You can do tests, you can observe yourself. You are, at the very least, a number of different internal systems, each of which can sort of take the cockpit over temporarily and speak, and then another one takes over a little while later. And you have these major systems, and then you have all these different sort of little parts, like we talk about in therapeutic parts work now. And each one, when it speaks, speaks as if it's the self. But if you look very closely, they don't agree. They're constantly bickering with each other, right? Night guy thinks he can stay up because morning guy has to pay for it. We behave as though we are legion. And so, how do you build a spiritual practice and a good, coherent, useful world map on that basis? That's something we're all kind of investigating. From my point of view, I think we can largely dispense with the notion of a self, even though I think the complexity that makes you up does have a particular signature to it. But fundamentally, we can think in terms of good teamwork rather than a unified self. And you're trying to get good teamwork by bringing these different aspects of your subjectivity together. We can look at that psychologically from the inside or neurologically from the outside. But we see that there are these disparate, subjectively capable intelligence systems inside us. And then the question for my work and the question for Gurdjieff's work as well is how do you make those parts into a richer, more entangled, more integrated team so that the effects you get out of them have more of an overall coherence that he calls being and a different kind of mode of living that comes out from this integrated intensity. And so you have to figure out ways to make those parts recognize each other, comment on each other, experimentally try to harmonize, or experimentally try to struggle. Because one of the interesting things in the kind of neurons that fire together, wire together type paradigm is that just by making them touch each other, even if the touch seems unpleasant, they become more aware of each other. So the more explicit you can be about generating cognitive dissonance, about making parts of yourself argue with each other about reality, the more integration you actually get out of them because you're there forcing them to touch each other. And over time, that builds into a more general, more whole type of being.
Awesome. Yeah. And, you know, this, as I said, is the first volume out through the Metamodern, I'm sorry, through the Sky Meadow Institute series on metamodern spirituality through Sky Meadow Press. And a lot of the Institute framings and the other works that we'll be publishing, I think, have a through line through what you're talking about, which is this notion, kind of classic integration and complexity and emergence sort of frameworks, right? Of parts coming together to create wholes that are greater than the sum of their parts through a kind of surplus emergent cohesion that produces new capacities and capabilities, which is, yeah, again, sort of a staple of various kinds of complexity thought. And when you look at the universe and what it's doing over the course of cosmic evolution, we can see that what we're engaging with spiritually in the mode that you're talking about has deep consonance and kind of structural analogs with what go all the way down the complexity stack over these 14 billion years in terms of parts coming together and creating more integrated wholes with new capacities and kind of more energy unlocking configurations. And I wrote the forward to the series for this to try to bring out some of those elements because I think that this aspect of Gurdjieff's work and the light that you're shining on it is really helpful for being able to appreciate those kinds of sort of spiritual praxis that are intentionally and consciously trying to do that at the human level, and to appreciate also that these are, in a sense, sort of cosmic configurational structures that we can see happening anywhere that there's sort of complexification and emergence happening. Do you have any thoughts on that way of framing it? Do you think it does things that, or what are the pros and cons, I guess, for putting it in that framework?
The pro is that it's very consonant with the leading edge of contemporary science, and that you can find in a lot of the great thinkers. You can certainly find it in Gurdjieff's imaginative cosmologies that he lays out in books like Beelzebub's Tales. You can find a cosmic to biospheric to sapient to transformational kind of story that we're all somewhat familiar with from the great thinkers of the latter half of the 20th century. I think it's a the positive is it's a very welcoming space because it's resonant with people's contemporary sense of the background nature of reality that we've started to figure out. It welcomes in strong thinkers, it welcomes in scientists. And it is, I think, admirably skeptical and somewhat agnostic, even as it proposes rigorous spiritual practice and deep engagement with spiritual ideas. I think the argument against it, I don't find too strong. I'm definitely in the pro camp on this one. But I think you could argue that it doesn't focus on the purity of consciousness as much as a lot of people are desperate to focus on that. Uh, I think you could say that it's very often too complicated for a lot of people to track and not at all the kind of framing of spiritual practice or religious community that would speak to them as emotional and social beings.
Mm.
Now, there's different kinds of experiments and ways to mediate between those two positions, but I think you could make that challenge to it, although I think that challenge is surpassable.
Yeah. Well, I remember in one of the Metamodern spirituality labs that we did some practices that you led that were kind of framed in this way of just linking up, head, heart, and body, essentially, of trying to just, if you take those as something like subunits or sub processes, subsystems within the self system, bringing those into mutual alignment, which again, I thought was very powerful because it shows how intuitive some of these things can be, and it yet not immediately obvious how a practice like that would relate to things like cosmic complexification and emergence, right? So I get that disparity, but I think that there are also ways that when you foreground the practice elements of this, they become embodied in such a manner that I think affords really fascinating convergences between some of these, as you say, really kind of highfalutin complexity scientific frameworks and some of just the deeply intuitive embodied kind of work that can be done and felt very, to be of spiritual significance at that level. And I think a work like this kind of helps fold all of those things in together. Well, another you also brought up this sort of shamanic lineage that there's a sense needs to be somehow reclaimed or re-understood and then redeployed in our current moment. And I know that a lot of the work that you're doing, you just presented at Icon, the Integral Conference out in Boulder there, or is it Denver? It was Denver, right?
Denver. Yeah.
Talking about archaic futurisms and sort of the meta shamanic, and this has been an important aspect of your work for some time. And it seems, as you say, that Gurdjieff had a similar sense of being a figure with a long lineage, doing certain kinds of work in the world that might take on different forms or colorations depending on what particular moment or period one is in. And so being, as you say, sort of for him at the kind of cusp of or the climax of modernity itself, that took on a different, a particular flavor, and yet the moment that we're in calls forth its own particular unique challenges. So setting that up a little bit, maybe just say more about that aspect of his work because I wanted to dig in a little bit there with the sort of the meta shamanic lineage and what all that entails.
Yeah, the concepts around meta shamanics are very much at the forefront of a lot of work that I'm doing, so I bring that lens to interpreting Gurdjieff's work. And I think it creates or co-creates a certain version of Gurdjieff that is interesting and should be added into the panoply of different possible interpretations and appreciations of this character. Where I think he's at his most shamanic in a couple of areas. One is he's looking constantly, especially in his young life as a archaeological seeker and experimental practitioner. He's looking for what's upstream of the different esoteric lineages. Now, unlike us, he's growing up in the ruins of temples, right? In the late 1800s. You still could just, they couldn't translate the hieroglyphics. You just wandered out to an old temple and maybe it was 3,000 years old. Like, all of this stuff was there and you could just access it directly. So there was this sense that you could find these hints of higher thought and deeper practice, and that in yourself, whether you're making that up or discovering it is a bit of an open question. It's a bit of an open question whether Gurdjieff has a lineage or is an inventor of a lineage. But nonetheless, you find these pieces in different cultural traditions, and in you, they feel very consonant. They interdigitate, I heard somebody say recently. And so it's very natural to, at least imaginally, and perhaps actually historically, suppose that there was some kind of wisdom network or proto lineage that's upstream of what we find in yoga, what we find in ancient Egypt, what we find in the deep Middle East, what we find in the Zoroastrians, right? There's some kind of period where it would have been, for a variety of reasons, plausible that an intertribal shamanic network would have flourished and helped to create civilization, and then existed in different cultures through various kinds of streams that got lost or perverted and then found again and then reinvented all throughout the different histories. So, what's upstream of Hinduism? What's the proto Buddha? What's the Christ figure from before there was recorded history? All of those are really interesting, compelling questions. But aside from the speculation, it's almost certainly the case that whatever sort of basic human organism moves we do in order to create interpersonal and personal transformation likely were a feature of human life for the 100 to 200,000 years before recorded history, and that the ones we have in the various esoteric practices that we inherit today from the last few thousand years, that those have some connection to a long period of time in which people were experimenting in very naturalistic but also very profound ways with these techniques. So he's very attuned to that. He's looking for it in the signs he finds in the different cultures. In the contemporary culture, he's critiquing its artificiality. He's calling out for a subset of the population to be involved in this work, and that may have some resonance with what we're calling shamanoid subsets of the population. And he's also explicitly very ecological in his framing. Now, this isn't brought forth in all of his students, but in J.G. Bennett's work, particularly in his students, there's a really strong sense of the ecological myth that is necessary to anchor psychotechnologies for human culture going forward. Because if we're not doing this in a way that taps the archaic, utilizes the people who have the inherited instincts of the people who would have been shamanic in those cultures, and situates spiritual and developmental practice in useful ecological contexts, then we're basically not going to be able to solve the meta crisis. He didn't have that word meta crisis, but he's definitely looking at a global problem in the tension between Eastern and Western disciplines, and in modernity being left to its own devices.
Yeah, so thank you. That's good context there. And so, yeah, that was something that I wanted to dig in a little bit, specifically as it relates to this as mythos, as some kind of imaginal construct, but and to really um focus on the tension between the, let's say, difference between that as an imaginal construct versus as some historical proposition, because one of the things, of course, that I've been navigating a lot in the metamodern spirituality scene and in the metamodern Christianity scene specifically, where these issues are particularly paramount, is trying to parse out what's the history, what's the sort of mythopoeic, symbolic aspects of this that are deeply spiritually valid, but not history, we could say, and be able to give sort of modernity and modern historical critical methods their due as part of that developmental stack, but also deeply appreciate what comes out of pre-modern forms of religiosity and spirituality, on their own terms in a sense, but being able to appreciate what comes through from that and what also needs to be sort of overlaid with a critical sort of gaze, so that we're not necessarily naively buying into particular mythic structures behaviors that might have issues that might have downstream consequences for in various ways, and that can have all sorts of manifestations. So for Gurdjieff, it seemed to me like that was an interesting question to probe a little bit, and maybe for you as well.
Mm.
And I should have backed up a little bit, though I knew we'd get here at some point to foreground the point again that these are hyper personal essays. So it's a little bit, this is I'm reading, Layman Pascal's Gurdjieff. And so that's fun, but it also then becomes difficult for me to know, especially as someone who it doesn't deal a lot directly with Gurdjieff's own work or his more immediate students, parsing out which part is Layman Pascal's reading, which part is Gurdjieff emphasizing, and how are those things playing out. So some of this is a fun entanglement here that doesn't necessarily need to be parsed. But it is those sets of ideas that interest me as well. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And to frame it very directly, in case people are like, what is he getting at? It's sort of like, do you think Gurdjieff, quote unquote, really believed that there was some kind of ancient, group of sort of esoteric sages that formed some kind of, kind of community through time of which he was, in some senses a continuing part? Is that a particular aspect to the mythos that he would describe historical reality? Is that even an important question? Those sorts of issues. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I my feeling is that how to say this without sounding hyperbolic. He's beyond really believing in things. Right, which is to say the his experience and understanding of himself and the world doesn't require 100% buy-in to anything you hear about the world from anybody else.
Mm,
I think there are good reasons, and he probably would have had many good reasons given the knowledge of that time and his own experience of the world to think that there really are upstream esoteric influences. Now, are they going to be as simple as the kind of storytelling that you're going to get from the people around you or that you're going to use as a conversational or instructional device with others? Probably not.
mm,
I don't see anything in his work that is um, anything less than skeptical and multifarious and at least ironic. So let's say trans-ironic in the way that he holds knowledge. In fact, he has a deep skepticism about the role that conscious fact type knowledge plays in the conveyance of information to begin
mm,
with. So he plays with ideas, he changes ideas, he puts different spins on things. He does seem to believe, as part of his temperament, that intensely insisting on something is a very casual and sometimes useful thing to do. But that doesn't mean you don't say the exact opposite to someone else a little while later. So, from all I can see about him in both his writings and in the lore of his personality, he's not a guy who ever gets stuck in a particular idea set. Now, I know from personal experience that when you meet um, older quasi-ethnic representatives of a wisdom lineage who definitely have done developmental work. And they tell you about A, the magic powers upstream in their lineage, and B, the simplicity of the tale of how far back it goes. You have to at least half believe them because
mm.
you're impressed by the results that it's produced in these people.
Yeah.
But I think anybody who's playing in the metamodern headspace can do that very ably without sacrificing any of their skepticism. Now, not everybody can do that, and that's why the way of the sly man is not for everybody. Metamodernity is not for everybody. You may not even be ready to tackle the modern or postmodern complexity that you would need to have gone through in order to be ready for this. Some people can't take on practical instruction that's useful to them unless they really just grab it hard and have no mental competitors.
Yeah.
But I don't think Gurdjieff was ever like that, and most of the people in this audience are not like that either. I think we're all of the kind of temperament that allows us to just lean right into the utility of something as if without ruling anything else out of question in order to believe that. So that's the way I think he holds it. You get a similar question when it comes to the ancestry as when you ask the question about did he really believe you live beyond death? Right? And you get different indicators in different areas of his speech. Depends whether you think he means in his translation of his work you get a magical extra body after death? Or is this a different way of being embodied? Right? Is there a special world there? Is it an imaginal thing? How much credence do we put into either of those buckets? Do either of them or both of them collectively even represent the complexity of reality properly? And I think among Gurdjieffians, you find people who hold very tightly to the kind of lore that he creates, and you get other people who are very loose about that,
Mm,
who take it seriously but don't take it too seriously. And that's how I think he held it, because I think if you do enough inner growth, your sense of ideas is that they're useful or not.
mm,
That you're not, your being is such that it's no longer at risk from either taking them seriously or holding them lightly.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And that sensibility is something that to me again is very core to this metamodern sensibility and a metamodern spirituality. Um, it's it's an interesting thing to push on, as I've found in a number of conversations. I mean, ultimately, what you could say this breaks down to in a very kind of simplified way is just a pre-trans issue, right? A pre-trans fallacy, which Wilber talks about, of someone can say the exact same words, but it depends, in that meme, where they are exactly in their relationship to that set of ideas, right? That classic meme of, the dimwit over here and the sage over here, and then the person in the middle, and the bell curve is like, ah. But you can say magic is real on either sides of that bell curve, but they mean very different things on either sides. And so, one of the things that I feel like encountering a lot as I've been exploring more metamodern spirituality and Christianity conversations. I just mentioned that one specifically because that's a recent thing that's really been coming up, and it comes up especially in that context. Is um, I think that it's always not one can't always take for granted that that is where one is coming from, and that it's sort of like when someone says Christ is risen on Easter, you're like and then it's like, well, where is that issuing from in a kind of sensibility and propositional structure way, and then if you poke a little bit, does it mean, yeah, literally, like, raised from the dead, bodily resurrection, etc. And these sorts of propositional things are, again, I think, more paramount in Christian context, but it foregrounds something really important, which is the narrative aspect, the mythos aspect, and what we mean by and what significance we put into the symbols and the tales that we use to adaptively confront reality. And so it seems to me, in the context of this conversation, that Gurdjieff has a kind of mythos and a certain set of narrative propositions that kind of frame the work that he's doing. And it's an interesting question to me always to know, where is that person coming from in doing that? How literally are we to take these things? And I always think that that's an important thing to push on, because it does, I think, wind up revealing certain things about, again, where in that spectrum folks are coming from and how important those aspects are. And so, anyway, yeah, that's kind of a little bit more context to that. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, there's some interesting things there. I mean, I think he's very I mean, he's a yes and no guy, right? He believes in the utility of friction and contradiction and inner struggle. Even in the tales, if you read his semi autobiographical Meetings with Remarkable Men, one of the things he highlights some of the older sages he runs into helping him with is challenging him about basic developmental and reality truths that he holds dear. And so he's put those in that book to say, look, it's super useful for you to have a contrary story to the story you think is true and virtuous, so that you have to then deal with that, because that's where you have developmental possibilities. He's in the Christian sense, it's very interesting because he grew up in a somewhat Christian kind of culture and had a lot of interesting things to say about Christianity. A lot of people make the argument that he is kind of an esoteric Christian teacher,
Mm,
especially if we think about it in a quasi-Gnostic Eastern Orthodox kind of sense, not
mm,
necessarily in a North American Christianity. But he says, on the one hand, things like, If you want to lose your faith, make friends with a priest. And if you don't have a critical mind by nature, there's no point in you being here. But on the other hand, he'll say things like, you really shouldn't try to change somebody's religious narrative. Like whatever they grew up with, that's deep in their subconscious. And what we're interested in is the transformation of individuals. And we're going to
Mm,
work with what they've got. The point is not to convert them to some other narrative or set of
mhm,
symbols or words. You're kind of trying to abuse them in favor of another idea that you've had. Really, just take them with whatever they've got and try to make them capable of developing and deepening and enacting whatever that is. So that's his like yes and no on religious narratives in general, I would
yeah.
say. But in addition to that, he creates his own religious narratives,
Mhm,
particularly in Beelzebub's tales, and they are absurd but oddly compelling, sometimes very complex, and you got to read it 3 or 4 times to even figure out what he's trying to say. They have a thing that we will become familiar with later in culture through, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and stuff like that, of like smart, big picture, funny science fiction versions of analyzing deep philosophical problems. And he's doing this in the 20s and 30s, so it's really kind of neat. And it's part and parcel of that radical avant garde French art movement that was going on around him at that time as well. But there's something really distinct about the size and the intensity and the richness and the hilariousness of the kind of pictures he generates. And if you can get a grip on the imaginal narrative he's proposing, and also ask yourself, why is he emphasizing these things? And also ask yourself, what would it be for me to be a producer of imaginal narratives with that
mm,
intensity?
mhm.
Then something really interesting starts to come forward. I really like, an inquiry into why he emphasizes certain things. And I think the emphasis on ecology, there's still a lot for people to explore there in his work. But my experience of being with spiritual teachers is, well, I think we've talked about this before. You can be really impressed by someone, and every word out of their mouth sounds like gobbledygook. You're like, are you some kind of paranoid moron? And you're like, but I got to put up with this because you clearly have something I don't have, and I want it. So there's a question about whether the developmental journey is a journey from sort of idiosyncratic subjective nonsense to something like objective fact, which is a kind of modernist story, or whether it's a journey from being impressed by the intensity of someone else's nonsense and going, I wish my nonsense could be that good. Right? I would like to evolve to a point where the surrealistic weirdness that comes out of my subconsciousness has real wisdom encoded in it
Mm.
and not just self-referential idiocy. And I think he's kind of demonstrating that is that if you get to a certain point in the evolution of your imaginal capacity, you can imagine really weird shit, and yet it's got really important things to say in
It's got legs.
it.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because it's like I think it makes me think of Nietzsche as well. But Nietzsche, um, who in many ways wrote his own Bible in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's a figure who doesn't want followers, right? Or who wants his followers to not follow him, right? You are a follower of Zarathustra if you're not just like, yes, master, but you're actually, and so there is a question there for me about Gurdjieff because he was a certain kind of spiritual leader who did have school and followers, and it seems like there's some element of that in his sort of religious or spiritual pedagogy, but there is also a way that I think maybe that lands differently than if Nietzsche had ever even had the opportunity to have followers or not. Would he have done something similar to Gurdjieff or something totally different and said no, get away from me. So the idea of the idiosyncrasy of the focusing on the empowerment of the individual to come up with these uh, potent narratives and stories and nonsense, let's say, seems to also be a potential sort of danger if people miss the fact. It's sort of that classic, you mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. Is it like, oh, this guy's got great nonsense, let's sit at his feet and learn his lessons, or is it to take the exemplar of the figure themselves to go do your own thing? And I use the word nonsense again in the same way that you were just using it, not that nothing disparaging there. So there's an interesting tension there, I guess is just one thing I'm pointing to. And I have another way I want to, angle this, but I don't know if you have any other thoughts related to that, or I can angle away.
Well, I'll throw in a distinction that I use a lot and that is sourced in Gurdjieff's repeated use of this distinction, which is esoteric, mesoteric, exoteric. Right. So there's a way in which we understand the world as consisting of people that really want in on the practical, self transformational, and subtle aspect of something, and they're willing to do the work to undermine the assumptions they're making about it in order to put it to work in their own embodied character.
Mm.
And then there are people who are not going to put in as much work. They're interested, they're resonant, they approve of things like that in general. They'd like to know more about it. They think it's probably a good thing if it was communicated more widely. They like to challenge themselves a little with this stuff. And then there's the bulk of the global village. And the bulk of the global village is already very busy. Many of them are distressed. Many of them came with prepackaged stories that they were born into. They don't have time to go through all of this nonsense. And some of them will show up in these spaces as well, right? And they'll have different responses. Sometimes it's just Gurdjieff helps out a human being as a human being, right? Maybe he's buying. There's famous stories where he's like buying people's shitty art when he stays in Paris during the Nazi occupation, right? And he doesn't like the art, but somebody's got to help this poor old lady live under French occupation, so he buys her paintings. There are ways in which he's just basically humanly supportive, but he's not trying to communicate advanced ideas to those people. And if they were to encounter those ideas, they'd probably hold them, let's not say wrong, but in a way that's not super productive or advanced, right? And then there's ways people are going to hold it in that mid range. And if they take it too seriously, they can go astray because they're actually only half interested and they want to be useful. And then there's ways of holding the same ideas that the really subtle people do. And they're kind of have an inborn instinct for taking it way too seriously and not seriously at all because they're trying to do something with it. So I think there's a human wisdom in the fact that you're going to run into all these different degrees of interest as well as all the different types of human beings. And there's no way if you have any kind of open door policy or public teaching or you've written books, you're going to run into all these kinds of people. And some of them are going to think you're a monster. Some of them are going to get it. Some of them are going to be half interested. Some of them are going to think every word out of your mouth is gospel. And then what do you do with those people? Either try to disabuse them of that notion or let them have it. Or, right, there's this play of all these
Yeah.
different types is kind of inevitable. So we don't need to despair that people are going to take it way too seriously in some respects. We have to anticipate that that's going to happen, but also we have to figure out little ways to make the richer, more complex, slightly more challenging version of it be privileged in some sense.
Yeah. Which raises another question more immediate to the angling I was thinking of maybe doing, which is I brought up again that this is Layman Pascal's Gurdjieff, and so there's an element here of you finding something deeply valuable here, but also wanting to put a spin on it, or even whether there's always questions of how conscious or unconscious these spins are and that sort of a thing. But there's clearly it's a framing and a presentation to both get Gurdjieff's ideas, but also your ideas, and so part of me wonders about that, like how would you say? Um, are there elements that you could speak to where you are even maybe yourself aware that Gurdjieff wasn't saying this, but I am having him say this, or uh, Gurdjieff lands better for me if I read him as saying this, etc. The way that we do with writers and sages and teachers, that we interpret their messages and then put a kind of spin on them for skillful means to both have them be more functional and adaptive and useful for us, but also to allow them to be translated for a broader public in a way that lands more effectively. Is there something egregious about trying to parse that out explicitly, or shall we leave that part of the wonderful, serious play of this text and leave it as some of a mystery?
It's a great question. I don't think there's anything egregious about the inquiry, but it's a difficult one.
Mm,
Right? Gurdjieff, like Nietzsche, is one of those people that I've spent a lot of time with. Now, I have a developed approach to writing and communication, which is character driven and humorous and weaves in a lot of ideas in a playful way and also uses, as he does, because his writing is very character driven and very oriented toward the unconscious in certain ways. So there's a kind of play off and against the surface of the content of the writing. But it's very hard for me to process information outside of this style of cognition.
Mm,
And I've spent so much time with this guy that I can't easily find the seams that differentiate it.
mm,
Without doubt, I mean, you're going to find a lot of objective information about Gurdjieff. You're going to find a lot of elements of the teaching. You're going to find a lot of his life story in this book. If this is your introduction, and then you go to a Gurdjieff meeting somewhere, you're not going to show up bamboozled, right? You're gonna be like, oh yeah, I've heard of that, I've heard of that, I know, right? You're getting a lot of introductory information here. If you're interested in my work, you're getting a lot of me in it as well. But if I ran into some new teacher and I went, oh yeah, here's how that guy lands for me, and I want to emphasize that, but I can see that it's not how it's landing for everybody. That would have been maybe something you could have asked me about 30 years ago. But at this point, so many of those tangles and folds have gone on that it would be an excruciating exegesis to parse that distinction in any regard in this. So it is important to remember this is quite transparently my Gurdjieff and an emphasis. And I think if you weren't trying to do your own, then you wouldn't really be making a contribution and you
mm,
wouldn't really be being honest
hmm.
either.
Yeah.
But for me personally, it's very hard to find a Gurdjieff outside of my understanding of Gurdjieff. And then the second problem to that is my understanding is so flexible that each discrepancy I might find, I can fold back in. So
Yeah.
I'm as much a prisoner of this as anyone else.
Well, it's a liberating prison, though. I think it's part of the sensibility that shines through that, again, I think of as having a kind of quintessential metamodern aspect to it. And you see this in metamodern works that there's a playfulness there, again, with all that seriousness, but even in the relating to the material, there's not this sense of, oh, there's this objective thing that I have to faithfully translate and accurately convey through time to others in a way that totally corresponds to, reality, right? That's a lot of what's already been sort of deconstructed with all the postmodern understanding about interpretation and perspective and all that. So if you just own that and say, this is my perspective, my interpretation of this figure, and then in a way that has a wonderful elision with that perspective and the quote unquote truth of what the figure is. I think that that's a move that I think is important, that not a lot of people, it might make a lot of people uncomfortable actually at first when they're like, well, wait a second, you mean that this is somehow interpreted and not the absolute objective truth of the matter? And
How
it's like,
dare you, sir?
it's like, well, yes, do you want to know what all facts are? But rather than, again, letting that kind of sink into some sort of like, oh, I guess we can't know anything or whatever, we own that and live through it and perform through it as well. And it's a wonderful way of keeping that continuity, that lineage alive for people because it's always being updated. I guess one of the things that for me is always important, going back to that pre-trans thing, is I always want to foreground that. I want to render it conscious so that people are aware of that going on, because I think that's a big part of the move. Because we are always doing this, right? My understanding of Nietzsche or my understanding of Darwin or Jesus is Brendan Dempsey's version, right? But then rather than delude myself into thinking that, yes, this is the one, we frame this and it becomes a way in which our own engagement with the materials itself is a participatory, malleable, co-creative act of bringing something forward through time. And I think that that's what you've done with this figure, and I think that you've already alluded to it in a number of ways, but I'll make it explicit just in the sense that I think the playfulness that you see in this figure is also coming through in your own representation and interpretation of them and in your own presentation of this work. And so there is a playfulness in this book itself that is reflective of the subject matter in a way that I think it keeps it very alive and updates it for people. And so none of that is accidental. I guess I'm just saying, like that is
Yeah.
that's part and parcel of the whole thing.
each word in the title and subtitle is doing a lot of work, and the work that the word hyperpersonal is doing pertains very much to this because there's a an element in which people want to present their interpretations as if it's fact, which is in fact how they live with it. And then there's a kind of owning that, which is, oh, these are personal essays. Okay, great. But then this is leaning into that. It's hyper personal essays,
Hmm.
which means simultaneously, we're not just going to admit the subjectivity, we're going to kind of live into it in a more intense way and see if that makes it more productive. But it's also hyper personal in the sense that it's very character driven. This is a character's assimilation of another character. And I think that that's Gurdjieff has some very interesting ideas in my viewpoint about how information is communicated spiritually, right? A lot of it is practical, a lot of it is his music and his dances and things you can't really put into a book. A lot of it is you have to find ways to bypass the conscious mind and communicate to the unconscious and get outside of socially normalized forms of the conveyance of wisdom because that socially normalized section of the brain will shut that down in terms of how much can become an embodied part of you. But there's also this element where um, the integration of everything he's talking about is in him itself. Like for me, um, the final book, Life is Real Only Then When I Am, to me, that's the best written book. He's gotten better at it with each iteration of his writing. And I see a little bit of it in the opening chapter, the introduction to Beelzebub's Tales, when it's more about him talking about how he's going to write this book and the conundrum that he's in. To me, that the presence of his character is the place where the integration of this multiplicity and of this critique and of this distance from what you're performing in a way that doesn't undermine the performance. That's where it all comes together, is in the richness of the person. And that's what I hope to convey a little bit of because that's one of the things I love so much about him and his work.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and just before we close a little bit, I think that that does relate a little bit to that angle I was just going to throw into this topic, which is that there's one of the things that the issue between narrative or mythos and sort of embodiment or practice sort of gets at is that there's a way in which the propositional ideas of a story about reality often leads us into this sort of transcendental sphere, and it becomes the story that, yes, this is what it's all about and this is where I'm going after I die, and then there's this being and all this stuff, and it becomes very otherworldly in that sense, or at least that it tends in that direction. And some of that could be just contingent of this is where the book religions show up, and this was the axial age, and these were the sorts of thoughts people were talking about. There might also be something more intrinsic to just narrativizing and the directions that that's liable to go on. I'm sure that Benita Roy would probably have some thoughts about some of that and abstraction and whatnot. And then there's this other thing, which is about praxis. He was a dance teacher officially, right? He was this is about embodiment. This is about how we actually in our own persons bring together all these subpersons and subsystems to effect a kind of lived phenomenological experiential surplus. And that's a kind of that's a kind of different angle on things. It's a different focus. And so trying to play best between narrative and practice is kind of there's a maybe a tension there. And for me, I see a lot of what metamodern spirituality is being about is in some ways, one, making those not so tense of a relationship with each other, right? Of somehow integrating even those, but even deeper than that, finding whatever that transcendental aspect of sort of religions historically, finding that actually now rooted in the immanent world, where I wrote through a pseudonym, this book called Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence. And that was from some time ago. But one of the things I kept seeing about all these forms of metamodern spirituality was that whole notion of the two worlds mythology and the immanent world versus the transcendent world, that had been sort of collapsed, that there was this one world, but that transcendence was somehow in the world, right? And that there was somehow a new way of conceiving that kind of fundamental spiritual relationship of the immanent to the transcendent. And I mention all of that because I feel like in Gurdjieff's work there is that rooting of the spiritual life in the immanent world in some way. However, that plays out in relationship to some of the mythos, there is this sense of, this spiritual teacher is not coming to tell you, oh, here's the new set of propositional facts and dogmas you need to believe to be saved, right? He's teaching you to dance. He's playing with your emotions. He's he's working with you at sort of a somatic and an embodied level, and all of that again I think speaks to a lot of what has increasingly become the direction that spirituality is moving in, and in a metamodern context is sort of is very emphatically about to sort of mixing those two things. So that was just another thing I wanted to throw into this mix of thinking about Gurdjieff as a kind of a grandfather of metamodern spirituality in the kind of focus that he was bringing to these things. Any thoughts on that, and maybe trying to tie that together with some of the other things, because they're all very alive in my mind, but I'm not sure if they're immediately landing for people.
I think there's a lot that could be said about the what I call strong transcendence with preeminent immanence in
Hmm.
Gurdjieff's work, and about how non-duality shows up in his work, and about how the integration of what's sometimes called the descending current in spirituality shows up in this work. That it's very earthy, it's very humanizing. As much as there are fascinating stories and non-ordinary possibilities of consciousness and experience being
Hmm.
presented here, it's your everyday experience. It's your embodied experience of the struggles that you go through in your life and in your relationships and in your attempt to grapple with the nature of reality, including all of its suffering and all of its frictions. That's sort of that's the stage where the Gurdjieffian performance is actually located. It's called the fourth way, is sometimes called a way in ordinary life.
Hmm.
It's not going apart to the ashram or going apart to the monastery. It's feeding on and catalyzing change within the processes of our ordinary experience. So, this world is the location of what was previously referred to as otherworldly phenomenon in
Hmm.
various ways. Now, one other thing I'd say about that, and when we first had the conversation about, well, should we start a press? And you were kind of enthusiastic about the possibility that I had a bunch of unpublished manuscripts. And I'm very happy that we went with something that was newly generated, because in a way, this is the view of Gurdjieff from Sky Meadow,
Hmm.
right? You were talking about the embodiment practices and the dances. Well, we have people gather for these metamodern spirituality labs, and the percentage of what goes on there, which is body work, which is dance, which is song, which is all that, that's a really huge part. And we might not have been able to predict that in advance. The part of this that's going on, which is saying yes and no to narratives, which is embracing tradition, but also holding a skeptical distance, but not being sabotaged by that skeptical distance, which
Hmm.
is imaginal co construction of narratives that have deep wisdom and practical reality built into them, is a huge part of what's going on. New approach to language and communication and cosmic and developmental model building is going on, but also not getting trapped in that as if the academics of it were the essence of what was going on in
Hmm.
metamodernity or spirituality. So all of these kind of things, which you could argue are the interpretation of Gurdjieff that I'm bringing forward, they're very much the same kinds of things that we're doing and holding and making space for at the Metamodern Spirituality Labs at Sky Meadow. So I really feel like this is Gurdjieff seen through the lens of Sky Meadow, which makes it a really good initial book in a way that recycling an old unpublished
Hmm.
manuscript of mine wouldn't quite have done. This comes out of the work that we've been doing together in that place.
Hmm. That's awesome, and a wonderful just kind of last way to frame this, which is yeah, that's what this book is, volume one from this new press, and it's been a delight again working with you, Layman, reading this manuscript, and now getting to share with you in the joy of seeing it go out into the world and people engage with it and chew on it and explore this figure, who you're sort of paying back with this work, through this work, and giving that a whole new set of yeah, kind of advancing that lineage in a new way through this. So I'll put a link obviously to where people can get this if what we've been jamming on for the past hour in 15 minutes is in any way interesting to people, and probably they wouldn't still be here if it weren't. So any final thoughts? Anything else you want to throw in before we wrap this up? And yeah.
In a shocking twist, publisher advocates book. um, if I was going to be serious about it, I would say to anybody who's followed through this far, rewatch this and try to track yourself mentally, emotionally, and somatically the whole time.
Interesting. Nice. Well, to the degree I've been able to track myself and to the degree I can track myself right now, I'm full of warmth and love and appreciation for you. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this, to write this book, and to be doing all the incredible work that you have been doing and are continuing to do. And some of which, as you noted, has been happening here at Sky Meadow. We'll probably be doing another video shortly to talk about the upcoming Harvest Metamodern Spirituality Lab here, which is really already not too far away. So I look forward to have another chance to talk with you about that. But as always, Layman Pascal, thank you, my friend.
Yeah, well, always a pleasure.